Walter stepped out of the small diner, holding a brown paper bag filled with his favorite meal. The sun was warm on his wrinkled face as he carefully walked toward his old car, parked a few feet away. His hands, stiff with age, trembled slightly as he reached into his pocket for his keys. The parking lot was nearly empty, except for a group of bikers standing near their loud motorcycles. They laughed and talked loudly, their leather jackets shining in the sunlight. Walter paid them no attention. He just wanted to get home, eat his food, and rest. As he took another step forward, his grip on the bag loosened, and it slipped from his fingers. The paper crumpled as it hit the pavement, and Walter sighed. He bent down slowly, his knees aching, trying to pick it up. Before he could reach it, a heavy black boot stomped down on the bag, crushing it. Walter looked up, surprised. A tall, muscular man with a thick beard and cold eyes smirked down at him. His leather vest had the name Brent stitched on it. "Oops," Brent said, grinning. "Guess you gotta be quicker, old man." The other bikers laughed, their voices echoing through the empty lot. Walter straightened up slowly, feeling a tightness in his chest. He had met rude people before, but this was different. There was something cruel in Brent's eyes. "I just want my food," Walter said calmly. "Please move your foot." Brent chuckled and lifted his boot, but only to kick the bag further away. It slid across the pavement, stopping near the bikers. They laughed even harder. Walter sighed again. He didn't want trouble, but his legs were tired, and he had spent his last few dollars on that meal. He took a step toward the bag, but Brent blocked his way. "Where you going?" Brent taunted. "You in a hurry." One of the younger bikers shifted uncomfortably. "Come on, man," he mumbled. "He's just an old guy." Brent turned and shot him a sharp look. "You got a problem, Jake?" he growled. Jake looked down, shaking his head. The other bikers went quiet, waiting to see what Brent would do next. Walter swallowed hard. He wasn't weak, but he wasn't young anymore. He knew he couldn't fight back. "Please," he said again, his voice steady. "Just let me pass." Brent smirked and stepped even closer, towering over Walter. "What if I don't?" he sneered. For the first time, Walter felt a prickle of fear. The parking lot was too empty, too quiet, except for the sound of the bikers chuckling. The people inside the diner wouldn't hear anything. Just then, a shadow moved across the pavement. Someone was watching. Across the lot, leaning against a black truck, a tall, muscular man stood with his arms crossed. His baseball cap was pulled low, but even from a distance, his strong jaw and broad shoulders were impossible to ignore. Dwayne Johnson had seen everything. He hadn't planned to get involved. At least, not at first. But as he watched Brent shove Walter's shoulder slightly, making the old man stumble back, something in him snapped. He pushed off the truck, adjusting his cap. It was time to step in. Walter took a deep breath, steadying himself after Brent's shove. He had faced tough situations before. He had been in the military, after all. But age had slowed him down. His body wasn't as strong as it used to be. Brent smirked, his arms crossed over his broad chest. "What's the matter, old man? You gonna cry?" The other bikers chuckled nervously, but not all of them seemed comfortable. Jake, the youngest, shifted from foot to foot, clearly unsure about what was happening. Walter held Brent's gaze and said calmly, "I just want my food. I don't want any trouble." Brent scoffed. "Trouble? You're not in charge here. We are." He stepped even closer, his voice low and threatening. "You should walk away before you get hurt." But before Walter could respond, a deep voice cut through the tension. "I think he's had enough." The air in the parking lot seemed to shift. The laughter stopped. The bikers turned toward the voice. Dwayne Johnson stood a few feet away, his hands resting casually on his hips. His sharp eyes were locked onto Brent, and though his expression was calm, there was no mistaking the authority in his voice. Brent frowned, taking a second look at the man who had spoken. He was tall, really tall. His arms looked like they could bend steel. Something about him seemed familiar, but Brent didn't fully recognize him yet. "And who are you?" Brent asked, narrowing his eyes. Dwayne took a slow step forward. "Just someone who doesn't like seeing bullies pick on old men." The parking lot fell silent. Even the bikers weren't sure what to say. The name Dwayne Johnson was famous, but none of them had made the connection yet. Brent let out a short laugh. "Listen, buddy, this isn't your problem. Walk away before you regret it." Dwayne raised an eyebrow. "You think I'll regret it?" Walter, who had been watching quietly, now saw what was happening. His tired eyes widened slightly. He knew exactly who was standing beside him. Jake, the young biker, suddenly gasped. He leaned toward one of his friends and whispered, "Dude, do you know who that is?" The biker shook his head. Jake swallowed hard. "That's The Rock." The realization spread like wildfire through the group. Their faces changed from smug amusement to shock. Brent was the last to figure it out. He looked at Dwayne again, this time with recognition creeping into his expression. Dwayne tilted his head slightly. "What's wrong? You were talking big a second ago." His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable challenge in it. Brent's confidence wavered. He was used to being the toughest guy in the room. But now, standing in front of one of the most famous and physically powerful men in the world, he wasn't so sure anymore. One of the other bikers, a stocky guy with a red bandana, cleared his throat. "Hey man, we were just messing around. No harm done." Dwayne's gaze didn't move from Brent. "Really? Because it looked like harm to me." He nodded toward the crumpled food bag on the ground. "Pick it up." Brent clenched his jaw. "What?" Dwayne's voice didn't rise, but it became even firmer. "Pick it up." Brent hesitated. His pride battled with his instinct for self-preservation. The bikers around him waited to see what he would do. After a long pause, Brent muttered under his breath and bent down, picking up the bag. He shoved it into Walter's hands without looking at him. Walter took it, surprised. "Thank you," he said simply. Dwayne smiled slightly. "That wasn't so hard, was it?" Brent glared at him but didn't reply. He knew he had lost this battle. Dwayne clapped Walter gently on the shoulder. "Let's get you back inside. I think you deserve a fresh meal." Walter chuckled. "Son, I think you just made my whole day." As they walked back toward the diner, the bikers stood frozen, still processing what had just happened. Jake whispered, "Dude, we almost fought The Rock." Brent swallowed hard. He wasn't going to forget this day anytime soon. The diner's bell rang as Dwayne Johnson and Walter walked through the door, and every head in the room turned toward them. For a moment, the busy hum of conversation paused. All eyes were fixed on the tall man who had just helped Walter, the frail elderly man, and made the bikers run off. Dwayne nodded to the server at the counter, who looked stunned. "2 coffees, please," he said with a smile, his deep voice warm. The server was still frozen, staring at him as if he had seen a ghost. Walter, who had been walking beside him, grinned. He had always been a quiet man, but now, in Dwayne's presence, he felt a little taller. People were looking at him with a new kind of respect. He hadn't realized just how much the bullying from the bikers had hurt him until he felt Dwayne's calm strength beside him. They sat down at a small booth by the window. Dwayne waved his hand as if to dismiss the attention they were getting. "Don't mind them," he said, chuckling. "Let's just enjoy our coffee." Walter smiled, but he couldn't help himself. "I can't believe this. One minute, I'm being pushed around by those bikers, and the next minute, I'm sitting across from The Rock." Dwayne laughed softly. "You don't have to believe it. You just had a rough moment, and I happened to be in the right place at the right time." Walter's eyes twinkled. "Right place, right time. You're too modest. You stood up to them, and you did what no one else would have. That takes guts." Dwayne looked down at the table, his smile fading slightly. "Sometimes, people just need someone to stand up for them. That's all it takes." As they sipped their coffee, Walter could feel the weight of the situation lifting off his shoulders. The warm mug in his hands helped calm the nervous energy that had built up in his body during the confrontation outside. But the more he thought about it, the more something inside him shifted. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was a part of something bigger now, a moment that wasn't just about an old man being bullied, but about standing together against injustice, no matter how small it might seem. The door to the diner creaked open again, and a few more customers walked in. As they passed the booth, one man stopped, staring at Dwayne with wide eyes. Is that really you?" he asked, his voice shaking a little. Dwayne smiled politely. "Yeah, it's me." The man's face lit up. "Wow, this is crazy. I can't believe it." He turned to his friend and whispered excitedly, "That's Dwayne Johnson, The Rock." The realization spread like wildfire. More and more people started to gather around the booth, asking for pictures, shaking hands, and offering grateful words to Dwayne. The atmosphere in the diner changed completely, and even Walter noticed how the people now looked at him with renewed admiration, like he was the lucky man to be in the presence of a hero. Walter couldn't help but feel a little proud. He had just been standing up for himself, trying to get through a tough situation. But now, because of the kindness of a stranger, he had become part of an incredible story. People were coming up to him, too, congratulating him for staying calm when things could have gone much worse. It was a strange feeling. Dwayne, however, seemed to be enjoying the attention for Walter's sake more than his own. "It's not every day you get to make a new friend, right?" he said, flashing a wide grin to the customers around them. As the din of conversation and laughter filled the diner, Walter felt more at peace. The nervousness and anger from earlier were slowly melting away, replaced by a calm he hadn't felt in a long time. Before he knew it, the bikers from outside came back into the diner. Walter tensed up, ready for another confrontation. But this time, things were different. The men, who had once been cruel, now looked uncomfortable and sheepish. They didn't make eye contact with Walter. Instead, they glanced nervously toward Dwayne. Razor, the leader of the bikers, shifted on his feet and cleared his throat. Sir," he began, hesitating. "We're sorry. We shouldn't have acted that way earlier." Dwayne's eyes met Razor's, and the tension in the air was thick. Razor seemed to shrink a little under Dwayne's gaze, but the apology was genuine. Walter smiled, his heart lighter. He didn't need to say anything. It was clear that even without a fight, things had changed. Dwayne gave a small nod of approval. "I think we're good now," he said. And with that, the bikers quietly left the diner, having learned a valuable lesson. Walter, on the other hand, knew he would never forget this day, and neither would the rest of the people who had witnessed it. The quiet hum of conversation returned to the diner after the bikers left. The tension that had filled the room earlier seemed to melt away, replaced by an air of relief and something more: respect. Everyone had witnessed something rare that day, and it wasn't just the fact that Dwayne Johnson had come to Walter's aid. It was the message behind it. Walter felt a lightness in his chest. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel invisible. He had spent years quietly going about his life, unnoticed by many, but today everything had changed. He had stood his ground, and thanks to Dwayne, the respect he had earned was far greater than he had ever imagined. As he sipped his second cup of coffee, Walter glanced over at Dwayne, who was chatting with the waitress. The man was humble, laughing and joking like anyone else. He wasn't acting like a celebrity or seeking attention. There was no arrogance, no ego, just kindness and a sense of calm that made everyone around him feel comfortable. Walter had seen famous people before: actors, musicians, even politicians, but they always seemed so far removed from everyday life. Dwayne was different. He wasn't just a famous face. He was a person who genuinely cared. Walter smiled. "You know," he said, drawing Dwayne's attention, "I never thought I'd be sitting across from a movie star, having coffee." Dwayne laughed and slid into the booth across from him. Well, you've earned it. You handled those guys better than most people would have. Walter shook his head. I didn't handle anything. I was just trying to get through the day, not make waves. Dwayne smiled kindly. Sometimes not making waves is exactly what's needed. And sometimes, when things go too far, it's important to step in. I could tell you were trying to avoid a fight, but it wasn't about the fight. It was about making sure you weren't pushed around anymore. Walter thought about that for a moment. I guess it's true. Sometimes we just let things go because we don't want trouble. But in the end, we end up losing more than we realize. Exactly. Dwayne leaned back, looking thoughtful. It's easy to let people walk all over you when you're alone. But when someone stands up for you, it makes a world of difference. And that's why I stepped in. Walter nodded, understanding more than ever. He had spent so many years just going along, letting people treat him however they wanted. But today had opened his eyes. It wasn't about being weak or passive. It was about knowing when to stand up for what's right. People need to learn that respect isn't something you earn just by being bigger or tougher, Walter said. It's earned by how you treat others. Dwayne smiled warmly. That's exactly it. And today, you showed them exactly what that looks like. As they continued to chat, a few people came up to Walter, shaking his hand or telling him how they admired how he'd handled the bikers. The word had spread quickly. Walter felt like a local hero, but more than that, he felt seen. For the first time in a long time, people were acknowledging him, not just as the quiet man who came to the diner every week, but as someone who had stood tall in the face of fear. One of the young women who worked at the diner approached their table, a bright smile on her face. I just wanted to say, thank you for standing up to those guys, she said, looking at Dwayne and then at Walter. It was really inspiring. Dwayne nodded in appreciation, then looked at Walter with a grin. See, you've got fans now. Walter chuckled. Well, I never expected this, but I guess it's nice to know that people are paying attention for the right reasons. Sometimes that's all it takes, Dwayne replied. A little kindness, a little courage, and it can change everything. As the afternoon went on, people came and went, but the energy in the diner remained different, lighter. Walter and Dwayne finished their coffee and exchanged a handshake. I won't forget this, Dwayne. You really made a difference today, Walter said sincerely. Dwayne smiled, standing up. No need to thank me. You did the hard part. You stayed strong, and that's what matters. Walter watched as Dwayne walked out of the diner, his powerful presence fading into the distance. But the lesson Dwayne had shared would stay with him forever. It wasn't just about standing up for yourself. It was about having the courage to make things right, no matter the cost. Walter knew that from now on, he wouldn't let anyone push him around again. He would stand his ground, with or without the help of a famous face. As the day drew to a close, Walter felt something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of pride. And in that small diner, he knew his life had changed for good. The next few days after that moment in the diner were a blur for Walter. Everywhere he went, people seemed to recognize him. It wasn't because he was famous, of course. It was because of the story that had spread through town like wildfire. Word had gotten out about the biker incident and how Dwayne Johnson had come to his aid. People were talking about it on social media, at work, and even in the grocery store. Walter, for the first time in his life, felt like he was part of something bigger. At first, he was a little overwhelmed by the attention. He had always kept to himself, avoided the spotlight, and enjoyed the quiet moments of his life. But now, things were different. People were stopping him on the street, offering kind words and pats on the back. It felt strange, but in a good way. One afternoon, Walter was at the local library, quietly flipping through a book, when a woman came up to him with a shy smile. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft. "Are you the man from the diner? The one who stood up to the bikers?" Walter looked up from his book, surprised. "I guess so," he said with a smile. That was me. She smiled even wider. I saw the story online. You're really an inspiration. I've been having a tough time lately, but hearing how you stood up for yourself made me think maybe I should stand up for myself too. Walter was touched. He hadn't expected his small act of standing up to the bikers to make such an impact on others. Well, I'm glad it helped, he said, his voice warm. You know, sometimes life throws tough situations at us, but it's how we handle them that really matters. The woman nodded. Exactly. I've been letting people walk all over me for too long, but hearing your story made me realize I don't have to keep doing that. Walter smiled and placed a hand on her shoulder gently. That's the spirit. Don't let anyone make you feel small. You're stronger than you think. As the woman walked away, Walter felt a sense of pride swell in his chest. He had always been the kind of person to keep his head down and stay out of trouble. But now he realized that sometimes doing the right thing, even in the smallest of ways, could inspire others to do the same. Over the next week, Walter started seeing the world differently. When he went to the grocery store, he noticed people giving him respectful nods, like they were silently thanking him. Even his old neighbors, who had never paid much attention to him before, now greeted him with smiles. They had heard about his encounter with the bikers and the hero who had stepped in. One afternoon, as Walter was walking through the park, he saw a group of teenagers sitting on a bench. They were laughing and talking loudly, but when they saw Walter approaching, one of them stood up and walked over to him. "Hey man," the teenager said, looking nervous. "I just wanted to say thanks for what you did. I heard about the bikers, and, well, I don't know if I could have done what you did." Walter smiled kindly. It wasn't about being brave. It was about doing the right thing. Sometimes, standing up to people who think they're tough is the most important thing you can do. The teenager nodded, clearly impressed. "I get it. You didn't back down, and that's something I respect." Walter patted him on the back. Respect goes both ways. You don't have to be afraid to stand your ground. You just have to know when it's the right time. It was moments like this that made Walter realize how far-reaching one small act of kindness or bravery could be. He had started to understand the power of standing up for what was right, not just for himself, but for others as well. That evening, as Walter sat down to his usual dinner, a knock on the door broke the silence. He opened it to find a familiar face standing there. Jake, the young biker who had been part of the group that had bullied him. Walter was surprised, but didn't say anything at first. Jake smiled sheepishly. "I just wanted to apologize again for what happened. We were wrong to treat you like that. I've been thinking about it a lot, and I just wanted to say I'm sorry." Walter nodded, his expression calm but understanding. "Apology accepted, Jake. We all make mistakes. What matters is how we grow from them." Jake's face lit up. "Thank you. I don't think I would have learned anything if it wasn't for that day. You taught me something that I won't forget." As Jake walked away, Walter felt a sense of peace settle in his heart. Life was changing for him, and he wasn't sure exactly what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't the same man he had been before. The events of that day in the parking lot had changed him, but they had also changed the people around him. And for the first time in his life, Walter understood the true power of standing up for yourself and others. It wasn't about fighting. It was about respect. And with that respect, anything was possible. As the weeks went by, Walter's life continued to change in ways he never expected. The attention he had received from that one afternoon in the diner slowly began to settle down, but the lessons he had learned stayed with him. He began to understand that it wasn't about the fame or recognition. It was about the impact he had on others and how standing up for himself had inspired people around him. Walter had always kept to himself, but now he found that people sought him out, not just for his story, but for advice. They came to him with questions, with their own struggles. It was strange at first, but he started to realize how much people respected him, not just for what he had done, but for how he had handled it. One day, as he was sitting on a park bench, enjoying the peace of the afternoon, a familiar face approached him. It was Jake, the young biker who had apologized earlier. But this time, Jake wasn't alone. "Hey, Walter," Jake said, smiling. "I want you to meet someone." A young woman stepped forward, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Hi, Mr. Walter. I'm Emily, Jake's cousin. I've heard so much about you." Walter raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Really? What have you heard?" Emily smiled. "Well, Jake's been telling everyone about what happened that day with the bikers. He said you're the reason he's changed his attitude. And I think that's amazing." Walter didn't know how to respond at first. "Well, I just did what anyone would have done." Jake shook his head. "No, man, you didn't just do something anyone would have done. You showed us all what real courage looks like. I've been working on myself since then, and Emily here has been helping me too." Emily smiled. "Jake's right. He's been different, more respectful, more kind to others. And we both think it's because of what you did." Walter felt a warmth spread through him. He had never thought of himself as a teacher or a role model, but here they were, telling him that his actions had changed them. It was humbling. "Well, I'm glad to hear that," Walter said, his voice soft. "But I think you're both the ones who deserve credit. You're the ones who made the choice to change." Jake nodded. "Maybe. But we wouldn't have known how to make that change if it wasn't for you. That day, you didn't just stand up for yourself. You stood up for everyone. You showed us how to respect others, how to be better." Walter didn't know what to say. He had never expected something like this to come from a simple act of standing up to bullies. As they continued to talk, Walter noticed a small group of people walking by. They seemed to be whispering and pointing, their eyes following him as they passed. Walter was starting to get used to it, but it still felt strange to be the center of attention. A little boy came running toward him, a big grin on his face. "Hey, you're the man who stood up to the bikers." Walter chuckled softly. "I guess that's me." The boy looked at him in awe. "You're my hero." Walter's heart swelled. It wasn't every day someone called you a hero, especially not a little boy. "Thank you, son," he said kindly, ruffling the boy's hair. "But remember, being a hero isn't about fighting. It's about doing what's right, even when it's hard." The boy nodded, still grinning from ear to ear. "I want to be brave like you when I grow up." As the boy ran off to join his parents, Walter turned back to Jake and Emily. "You know, I never thought of myself as anyone's hero," he said quietly. "I was just trying to get by, trying to be left alone." Jake looked at him, his expression serious. "You don't have to be a superhero to be a hero, Walter. Sometimes just standing up for what's right is enough to make a big difference." Walter thought about that for a moment. He had always tried to stay out of the spotlight, to avoid attention. But now he saw that the quiet acts of courage, the moments when you stand up for yourself and others, could be more powerful than anything else. As they said their goodbyes and Walter headed home that day, he felt something inside him that he hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose. He wasn't just living his life anymore. He was part of something bigger, something meaningful. And that was enough to make every moment of his day feel special. Later that week, Walter received a letter in the mail. It was from a local charity that helped underprivileged children. They had heard about his story and wanted to thank him for being such an inspiration. As a token of their appreciation, they had invited him to a small ceremony where they would honor him for his bravery and kindness. Walter was stunned. He had never imagined anything like this happening. He wasn't sure what to expect, but one thing was for certain. His life had taken an unexpected turn, and it was leading him down a path he never thought possible. Walter stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his jacket nervously. He had never been the type of person to stand in the spotlight, and yet here he was, preparing to attend a ceremony that would honor him. The letter from the charity had come as a complete surprise. It was an invitation to a small event where they planned to thank him for his bravery and the way he had inspired others. He still couldn't believe it was happening. The ceremony was being held at a local community center, a place where many of the town's events took place. It wasn't a grand building, but it had a warm, welcoming feel to it. Walter had passed by it countless times, never imagining he would one day be the center of attention there. When he arrived at the community center, the parking lot was already full. A small crowd of people had gathered outside, chatting excitedly. Walter stood by his car for a moment, feeling a flutter of nerves in his stomach. He didn't like being in front of large groups of people, but today was different. This wasn't about him. It was about the message he had unknowingly shared with everyone. How standing up for yourself and others could create a ripple effect of kindness and respect. As he walked toward the entrance, a few familiar faces smiled at him. He recognized some of the people from the diner and the park, people who had stopped to talk to him after the incident. They had all come to show their support. Inside, the room was filled with decorations and bright lights. The local band was playing soft music in the corner, and the tables were set with flowers and candles. It was simple, yet elegant. Walter took a deep breath and made his way toward the front, where a small stage had been set up. There, a group of people were waiting for him. The leader of the charity, a kind woman named Sarah, greeted him with a warm smile. "Mr. Walter, thank you for coming. We are so honored to have you here tonight." Walter nodded, feeling a little out of place. "I'm just a regular guy," he said, his voice soft. "I don't deserve all this attention." Sarah smiled gently. "You may not think you deserve it, but what you did changed so many lives. Your actions showed people the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. You taught us all a powerful lesson." Walter didn't know what to say. He was still wrapping his mind around the idea that his small act of courage had made such an impact. He had only wanted to protect himself, but now he realized it had gone far beyond that. He had given people the courage to stand up for themselves, too. As the evening continued, more and more people came up to Walter to thank him. A man from the diner approached him, shaking his hand with a smile. "I'll never forget how you stood up to those bikers. You helped me realize I don't have to be afraid anymore." The evening reached its peak when Sarah stood up and called for everyone's attention. She held a small plaque in her hand and walked over to Walter, her smile bright. "Walter, we want to thank you on behalf of all the people whose lives you've touched. Your bravery and kindness have inspired us all. We are proud to present you with this award for your courage and for being a true example of respect and kindness in our community." Walter felt a lump rise in his throat as Sarah handed him the plaque. The crowd clapped, and for the first time, he didn't feel embarrassed. He felt proud, not of himself, but of the change he had sparked in others. He stepped up to the microphone, his hand shaking slightly as he took the award. "Thank you," he began, his voice steady but emotional. "I never thought I'd be standing here. I didn't do anything special. I just did what I thought was right. But seeing how much it's affected all of you, it's more than I could have ever imagined. I'm truly honored." The room went silent for a moment before the applause erupted once again. Walter looked around at all the faces, some familiar, some new, and he realized something profound. He hadn't just stood up for himself that day in the diner. He had stood up for everyone who had ever felt powerless, for everyone who had ever been afraid to speak up. And because of that, they had found the courage to do the same. After the ceremony, people gathered around Walter to continue talking. They asked him for advice on handling difficult situations and how to be brave when the odds seemed against them. Walter shared his thoughts, always humble, always kind. He had learned that courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about acting in spite of fear. And that was a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his life. As he left the ceremony that night, Walter felt a sense of peace settle over him. He hadn't expected any of this, but it had come into his life in the most unexpected way. And now, more than ever, he knew that small acts of courage could make the world a better place. The days after the ceremony were peaceful for Walter. He had returned to his quiet life, but something had changed within him. He wasn't just going through the motions anymore. The people he had inspired, the lives he had touched, stayed with him every day. And every time someone smiled at him or stopped to thank him, he felt a warm sense of pride. Walter didn't need the recognition. He didn't need the awards or the applause. What mattered most was the difference he had made in the lives of others. But it was also clear that his life had taken a different path. People now looked up to him, and he had become a symbol of courage and kindness. It wasn't just about the bikers anymore. It was about standing up for what was right in everyday life, whether it was in small moments or big decisions. One afternoon, as Walter was walking through the park, he ran into Emily and Jake again. They were sitting on a bench, talking and laughing. When they saw him, they waved him over. "Walter, we've been talking," Jake said, a serious look on his face. "We've been thinking about how much you've changed things for us, and we wanted to do something to give back." Walter sat down beside them, curious. "Give back? What do you mean?" Emily smiled. "We've been working on a project. We want to start a community program, something to teach kids and adults how to be brave, how to stand up for what's right, just like you did. We want to call it Stand Strong." Walter was amazed. "That sounds like an incredible idea. But why me? I didn't do anything special." Jake shook his head. "You don't get it, Walter. You did something special. You showed us how small actions can create a big change. You inspired us to be better, and we want to pass that on." Walter felt a lump in his throat. He never thought something like this would happen. Never thought he would be the one to inspire a whole new project. But now, it seemed like his actions were continuing to ripple outward, touching lives in ways he couldn't have predicted. "This is your project," Walter said softly. "I'll be here to help however I can, but you two are the ones who are making this happen." Emily nodded. "We know, but we wanted to ask if you'd be willing to be a part of it. Maybe come speak at some of the events, share your story with the kids. You're the reason we're doing this, and we think your story can inspire others too." Walter thought for a moment. It wasn't something he had planned, but as he looked at Jake and Emily's excited faces, he felt a sense of pride. If his story could help others, then maybe he was meant to share it. "I'd be honored," he said with a smile. "I'll do whatever I can." Over the next few months, the Stand Strong program began to take shape. Walter, Emily, and Jake worked together, organizing events, reaching out to schools, and spreading the message of courage, respect, and kindness. It wasn't always easy, but they were determined. They visited schools, local clubs, and even local businesses to talk about how people could stand up for themselves and others in their communities. The first event was a success. Walter spoke in front of a group of students at the local high school, telling them his story and encouraging them to find their own moments of courage. The students listened closely, many of them inspired by what he had to say. For some, it was the first time they had heard someone speak so honestly about standing up to bullies and standing up for themselves. Afterward, a group of students came up to Walter to thank him. "Your story really helped me," one student said. Walter smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. He had never imagined that something as small as standing up to a group of bikers could lead to this, but here he was, helping young people find their voices. The program continued to grow. As Stand Strong expanded, it reached more people, adults who wanted to learn how to be braver in their own lives, and children who needed to understand how to be kind and respectful to others. It became a movement, a way for people to come together and stand up for what was right. Years passed, and Walter's life changed in ways he had never expected. The quiet man who had once kept to himself now found himself surrounded by people who admired him. And even though he never sought the spotlight, he had become a leader in his own way. Looking back, Walter realized that everything had started with one simple act, standing up for himself in the face of danger. He never imagined that act would lead to a community-changing movement, but it did. It was proof that even the smallest of actions could spark a ripple effect that touched lives far beyond what one person could ever imagine. As Walter sat on a park bench one evening, reflecting on how much had changed, he smiled. He had no regrets. He had helped people find their courage, and in doing so, he had found his own.